Serious, eerie towns, disappearing diners, and creepy gas stations. What's your true, unexplained story of being in a place that shouldn't exist? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Mom's seaside hometown has an offshore decommissioned lighthouse. The remote structure is locked and utilities have long been terminated. Yet, as I once commented, on a random late night occasions, the lighthouse beacon suddenly illuminates, casting light in various directions and amazing anyone who notices. No one has been able to determine how it happens, as the lighthouse remains locked and without utilities. By the time anyone travels out to investigate, the illumination has long ceased. An abandoned World War I era gunpowder factory. Middle of the woods, but there's fire hydrants, old railroad grades, smokestacks, fucking ramparts they built because the damn thing got explodey on more than one occasion. It's like they closed it one day and just left. It's not totally in the middle of nowhere either. Half-hour walk from the nearest road. Nature is in the middle of taking it all back, as it does, but it's not too far along in the process yet. Last year, my buddy and I were driving early in the morning to go hunting. We were in separate vehicles, but I was following him closely. Before we left town, we agreed that we would stop at a fairly huge natural landmark that was right off the road so we could take a piss. It was about a 2-hour drive in the dark. Anyway, we just keep driving and both arrived at our hunting spot. I was confused because we never passed the landmark that we agreed to stop at. I thought I must have just missed it or something. The first thing my buddy said when we got out of our trucks at the hunting spot was, "Where the hell was Hell's Half Acre, the place we agreed to stop at?" We both never saw it. You can't miss it. There is no other road we could have taken and missed it. I have no clue what happened that morning, but Hell's Half Acre disappeared on us. My family went camping somewhere, and I went off on my own to bike some trails. I came across an old decrepit cabin with half the roof left and some old furniture still inside, like a rusty old wood stove and a bed frame. The whole thing gave me an eerie but also tragic vibe. It was like the air around it was heavier. I went back to camp and told my family, and they wanted to see it too, so I led them back the way I'd gone, and it had disappeared. There was even a clearing, like where I remembered it being, but no cabin. We searched every trail the camp had and never found anything like it. I started having nightmares about the cabin while we were camped there. Eventually, we asked the camp host if there was any structures around, and she said the area used to be an old mining camp, and though it was supposedly gone a long time ago, I was not the first camper to see something unusual that could never be found back later. Old house where I used to live was known to have squatters. One night a loud rumbling was heard from the old house and several people screaming. All the adult men went to investigate and found nothing. It happened again and again. The people couldn't stand it and had contacted the current owner and told them what had happened. The owner was in another country, but he had some people come and destroy the place and turned it into a lot. No one knows what or where the sounds came from. I had older friends at the time, and they would sneak into the old house to smoke cigs and have sex. They would always see or hear something move inside the place. Once they started the whole night, and they kept hearing something muttering, and they couldn't find the source. The place is still a lot, and the owner refuses to have anything built over it. I was driving home from visiting my ex-girlfriend, who lives about an hour and a half away in a neighboring county. Our area is rural as hell. Lots of abandoned villages, back roads, wooded areas, etc. It was around 1 a.m., and I decided to go off the beaten path and drive down an old mine road about half an hour from my place. The scenic route, if you will. The road was unlit, but I noticed what seemed to be a massive bonfire in the valley nearby. Captivated, I decided to follow the light. To make a long story short, white robes everywhere. Exactly how you would imagine it. Not exactly a place, but I had a random encounter with a person that I was told doesn't exist, shouldn't have been out there. Shortly after I graduated high school, I went to a friend's house. He lived way out in the country, like a 30-minute drive on a small 2-lane road, then another 10 minutes on a dirt road just to get to where his double-wide trailer was at. I show up, and drinking and drugs were involved, as common in rural Oklahoma. It was pretty late, and everyone else had fallen asleep. So I went for a walk because I liked the woods. As I was walking for a bit, when I heard music. I followed the music to this small clearing. I stepped out, and there was some random hillbilly-looking dude just sitting on a log playing a flute. The situation was pretty random. There was no other house anywhere near us. There was no way anyone could have got to where we were without driving by us. And for those of you who have never been in a remote area, a car would have been extremely noticeable over the silence of nature. I sat down and listened to this random hillbilly Faye play, soft and low, melodic and emotional. He was surprisingly good. I had to pee, so I went off to the side. The music stopped. When I turned, he was gone. I walked around trying to find some trace of where he went. My grandfather taught me how to follow trails. I'm no expert, but I can track a deer if need be. I didn't see any indication of where this guy could have went to. I went back and told my friends the next morning. They looked at me like I was crazy and elaborated on how impossible that would have been. Every time I went over after that, I brought my clarinet, band geek, what can I say? I went out a few times to the same clearing and played, hoping the hillbilly Faye would show up again. Never saw him again. Maybe it was the drugs. When I was a teen, me and some friends broke into an abandoned petrol gas station that had been out of service since as long as we knew, all boarded up and desolate. We got in, messed about for a bit before realizing it literally still had everything in it. The till was empty, there, the tannoy system, old boxes of food on the shelves, everything. It was as if it had just been abandoned immediately and boarded up there and then. It was at night, and this was creepy enough, but then I noticed a dim hum from the far corner. Creeped over to have a look, and it was the ice cream chiller, still plugged in, still running, now almost full of ice. I chiseled the ice from around the lid and managed to crack it open, dug around inside and found it still had ice creams in. I tried a Solero, but it tasted watery. Weird experience, but absolutely true. I would never have gone in there if I wasn't with mates. We left shortly after, and all agreed that was very freaky. The rural woods around my mother's house. When I lived there for about 3 weeks, I was on my way home late at night coming from a friend's house. I passed the old elementary school, but right after doing so, this massive beach ball-sized orb floated in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes. I was completely sober, trying to get a better look at this thing, but it didn't stray from its floaty, up and downy movements across the road about 8 feet up in the air before it disappeared in the trees on the other side of the road. No, it wasn't a balloon. It was like a perfect ball made of thick fog. The next morning, I told my mom about this, and her eyes got all big before she told me that on multiple occasions she had seen a man at that same spot. She said he wears clothes that seem like they're from 100 years ago, that he walks behind her car and disappears from view in her mirrors. I live in Michigan, and I've done a lot of road travel around the Great Lakes area, and in addition, I've moved to Texas and back by driving my own U-Haul. I can say for certain that basically any gas station in Illinois, outside of Chicagoland, Indiana, Missouri, or Arkansas, will somehow feel like you've entered some other dimension. In particular, there's an Exxon station on the outskirts of Haiti, Missouri, that I actually ended up stopping at both times I passed through, on the way to Texas and the way back. You can't see anything but fields, and the road you came in on, it looks like it was picked up by a tornado and dropped somewhere entirely arbitrary. I was once driving around with my cousin, who had recently moved to Virginia, where I was staying with him for a week. We decided to go for a ride and smoke some butts, and I asked him to take a turn down a street I thought looked interesting. Just wanted to fuck around and figured it would be like some suburbs we could putt around at, but no. We wound up traveling up and down tight dirt roads surrounded by trees and bushes that seemed to almost be grabbing at the car. There was never a chance to turn around, but after a while we realized that we couldn't see the exit anymore. The road had a slight curvature to it, and it was taking us in deeper. We drove for like 15 minutes. The initial novelty of WTF did we get into now wearing off, and thoughts of, oh God, where are we setting in? Finally, we make it to an intersection where we see a billboard. I don't know what language it was in, but it wasn't in any language that uses the English alphabet, nor was it Japanese, Chinese, Korean, or Arabic. Maybe it was Thai, I don't know. But it blew our minds. We were so confused, we thought we just ended up in a different world. Drove a bit further, and there was a Burger King. We both breathed a sigh of relief when we saw that. I went to Big Bend National Park in West Texas and visited a town called Marfa in the middle of the desert. They have a phenomenon there called the Marfa Lights, in which if you look across the desert at night, you will see random flashes of color that are apparently unexplained. They hint at aliens. The town of Marfa is tiny, with a couple of hotels, a Dairy Queen, and some old rundown buildings. Me and my wife were getting dinner at Dairy Queen, and across the street there were like 50 youngish looking people, all fully dressed up like they were going to the club, walking down the sidewalk, not talking to each other. There's no club in this town, and it was very weird to see. I'm still convinced that Marfa is where the aliens land to get indoctrinated into earthing culture, and these young people I saw weren't actually humans, but aliens learning how to act human. Super weird. Look up the town. A 45-minute drive west of Gainesville, Florida, will bring you to the former town of Rosewood, still marked for posterity. I found it by accident while tootling around one random Sunday. 10 minutes away on the Gulf Coast is a very sleepy town called Cedar Key. Cute shops, galleries, cafes, etc. Rosewood was burned to the ground, all of it, in a 1923 race riot. We call it a race riot because there's no better word for it. Pogrom generally deals with European expulsions of minority Jewish populations, but that's what this was. All the black inhabitants were chased away, and none ever returned. Every detail of this story is rancid. The more details you know, the more entwined they get with the current nearby towns and descendants of the perpetrators. And it's not the worst story involving race riot in Florida for that decade. My cousin and I, 16 at the time, went down to the woods, Shining Cliff Woods in Ambergate, Derbyshire, for a walk to the abandoned wire factory built during the war in the woods so it wouldn't be bombed, then abandoned sometime. Anyway, we walked past some of the buildings, my cousin stopping to graffiti over one of the already graffiti-covered walls. We continued and rounded the end of one of the warehouses where we saw maybe a dozen and a few people sat in white, almost dressing gowns, sat talking with one standing in a red gown in the middle. We got the hell out of there. Unfortunately, not before they saw us. Didn't give chase or anything, but it was just very strange. Before anyone says, I doubt it was to do with the you-know-what clan, and was before the place recently was converted into a whiskey gin brewery place. It was just very odd, strange, and mildly terrifying. My parents and I took a trip to South Africa when I was a teenager. One of our stops was this sleepy little town right on the ocean. It was a popular place for shark cage diving, but it was the off-season, so it was eerily quiet, except for the wind and sound of crashing waves in the distance. Because it was the off-season, there were few places open, or they were open for limited hours. We were trying to find a place to eat, and the closest restaurant nearby looked just like a regular house, but with a sign out front and menu posted on the front door. We got there, and unfortunately it was closed, and were about to walk away when the owner opened the door and said she'd open specifically for us. Okay, we're hungry, and there's nowhere else to go. We go in, and I swear to God, this woman was a witch. The entire first floor of this little house was set up as a big dining room with completely mismatched tables and chairs. The walls were covered in dried herbs and miscellaneous trinkets. It was cold as hell, colder than it was outside. She would disappear into the kitchen and come back telling us the chef said X, but you could hear only her speaking through the doorway and no one else. We tried to place our order, and each time she would say something like, "Oh no, you don't want that. I know what you need." Okay, we ended up with 2 chicken schnitzels and some kind of stew. It was good, but she would kind of stand over by the kitchen door and watch us eat. It was unsettling. Another couple with a young child showed up as well, and the woman asked the little girl if she wanted to go upstairs and play with her pet rabbits. The girl excitedly said yes, and never came back down, even as her parents were eating and her meal sat untouched at the table. The whole town just had an odd vibe to it, and I wouldn't be surprised if we tried to go back there someday, only to find out it doesn't exist. It didn't help that our second and final day there, we all took some insanely strong Dramamine in preparation for the whale watching tour that got canceled. I don't know what was in that shit, but we were hanging from the ceiling until it wore off. This will get buried, but here goes. I have a couple of these stories, but this is probably the more interesting one. My partner and I traveled from Raleigh, North Carolina to Charleston, South Carolina back in 2016 to be in the totality zone for a solar eclipse. We were warned about traffic, but getting there we encountered nothing out of the ordinary, so we didn't think it would be an issue getting home either. We were wrong. At about 10 p.m. or so, after hours of nearly standstill traffic, and with neither of us having access to Waze or maps, I had a flip phone, and his phone only worked off Wi-Fi. We used a very old GPS to find an alternative route home. It was all back roads, through endless cornfields and tons of little southern Gothic towns with no one's lights on, few streetlights, and multiple churches and graveyards, with the occasional nighttime lurker, including one woman sitting in the middle of the street in one of the only towns with actual streetlights. It was totally eerie, but very cool, and I enjoyed the eeriness until I started to get tired. The speed limits were slow on these back roads, and the lack of lighting made me go even slower, so we weren't making good time at all. My partner does not drive or have a license, so he couldn't take over. At about 2 a.m., I was really struggling with drowsiness and was concerned about safety, and insisted that even though we weren't far from home, we either needed to pull over for a nap or find a motel. My hopes weren't high. I hadn't seen any motels, and we didn't have any resources to find one. Then, we found a motel. It was set way back, surrounded by trees, down an incline, somewhere between Aberdeen and Sanford, maybe Southern Pines. It looked old, in both a retro-Americano kind of way and a decrepit, run-down way, and almost had a vintage summer camp kind of feel to it, especially the sign that read something like Pinecone Motel. There were a couple lights on, so I pulled off and into the mouth of the entrance. I was so happy to have found one, but my partner was having none of it. He was totally opposed to the idea. I don't remember what his reasoning was, but he just did not want to stop there. After some bickering, we pulled away from the motel and continued on until I could take a nap at a rest area and then finally get us home around 3 to 4 a.m. I kept thinking about the motel from an aesthetic perspective. I'm into urbex and Americana photography and wanted to find it again, so I looked it up. Nothing. Absolutely no web presence anywhere. I went on Google Maps and spent an embarrassing amount of time going down that road looking for some semblance of it. Nothing. No reviews, no website, no phone number. I continued to search for it with some regularity over the years until maybe 2 years ago, I finally got a hit. Pinecone Motel in Marston. It had the right name and was in the right general area, but it wasn't the same motel we saw that night. The building was different, the sign was different, the trees were too sparse, the positioning was different, and there was no incline, whereas the motel we saw was at the bottom of an incline off the road. It's not the same motel, and the new one certainly doesn't seem new from the images. I have no idea what the story is of the motel we saw or where it went. I'd love to find it again though. My mother and younger brother live on a corner lot across the street from an old town hall, as well as a church in a tiny town. The one-horse town was supposed to be one of the larger settlements, but the capital ended up down the railway and pretty much made this one useless. However, they already built a large town hall building, and so they used it for all sorts of civil endeavors, like a post office, fire hall, prison cell, etc. After a century or so, it started to become run down, and they ended up relocating to a more modern building. It went up for sale, and someone bought it but didn't do anything with it, so it just sat. My father, who grew up around there, would talk about ghost stories about the place, like torture, hearing screams, iron doors slamming, and chains clanking. Sounded like classic dad stories. Until one year, I moved back there after a breakup. Falling asleep with my window open, I woke up to hear loud metal banging coming from the building, like it shook the neighborhood. My family was in the city, so I was alone and a little freaked. I first downplayed it as pranksters or a crazy echo from the train crossing across town, but it sounded so clearly from the building and didn't stop for what seemed like half an hour. The fucked part was the police did show up while the banging was occurring. I watched as the officers, via their flashlights, head straight through the basement and stop where the old cell is located, just as the banging abruptly stopped. After a brief pause, the flashlights slowly scanned the room, and I continued to watch as they slowly searched the whole buildings inside and outside. They eventually made their way back to their car and after a few minutes, drove off. It drives me insane, since I'm a skeptic, but I know what I heard and saw. The whole thing was vivid and sobering from any exhaustion. I still wish I could go back and ask what they saw or didn't see. I remember a time when my housemate and I had to take a bus to work. We took a bus that arrived at 5:30 a.m., so we were already very tired as always. Well, recently at that time, I had gotten really into a book, so on the ride I was absorbed into my reading. My roommate fell asleep. On the way to our job, we had to transfer buses one time. We missed it because I was too focused on my reading and my friend was asleep. I quickly noticed, however, when we approached the next stop, so I shook my friend awake and said we need to get off immediately. We could make our transfer bus if we hoofed it back to our missed stop on foot. It was only like a few blocks away. Immediately upon disembarking from the bus, I got a strange feeling. First, the wall of the building directly opposite of us as we stepped down had a massive cockroach crawling across it. Then, the street was lit by the kind of street lamps that cast a warmer, yellow-orange kind of light. Street lamps, in my experience, always cast either a very sterile white color light or that warm yellow-orange color. The sun was still coming up, but the lamps dimly lit our way. We had somehow wound up in the middle of what I deemed the industrial district. We were surrounded by warehouses, mills, factories, etc. The kind of buildings you don't normally just end up in the middle of. And, what was stranger still, crowds of workers were often just outside the buildings, presumably waiting for their shifts to start. But in the early morning gloom, barely lit by the weak orange lamps, they seemed to skulk in the shadows near the building's entrances. My friend was annoyed. Although he was equally culpable for us missing the stop, we rushed to make it to our bus, and even got split up as he was certain he knew the way. Eventually, we both made it, but it was strange. There was almost an imperceptible boundary between the industrial district and the part of town we changed buses. I'll never forget it, to be honest.